Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of this series of live Satsangs. As some of you may have read in the description, today is going to be quite an ambitious Satsang. I think it's ambitious to embark on this exploration that I hope to do today. And it could fall flat, but and it's not going to appeal to everyone because it's going to include the comparing of three different theoretical models, and it's going to include switching from one to another, and it might require someone to have a certain way of functioning that can visualize and switch with me as I switch from one model to another model and describe things which, or describe the experience of life from different perspectives, because in each model there is a different perspective of life. So the reason for doing this is to help, through the use of the conceptual models, help bring our focus onto what's here right now. So an example of a conceptual model is in the old days when people would hear thunder. They had an explanation about what the thunder was. So the explanation was that's the gods up in their house, up there, running around, and the thunder and the lightning is a sign of their anger, something along those lines. So there was a conceptual model that the person had that explained what the thunder and lightning was. Now, it turns out that that model got superseded by new models that were established based on a better understanding of things. So what I would like to put forward is three theoretical models that would all explain the present moment experience, the life experience that we all have. So really what I'm saying is, where does this experience come from? Now, actually the point is not to prove where it comes from, because the truth of the matter is, as I see it, knowing where all of this comes from is not something we can know. We can hypothesize, we can come up with a model of best fit as to where this comes from, but the point is not really to know where it comes from. The point is to become very clear on what this is, without necessarily needing to know where it came from. So talking about the three, so you might ask, so in that case, why are you going to go through three different models that would explain, each of them different, but each of them plausible in explaining what the experience we have is? Why would you bother about explaining the three models? And the reason for using the models is that hopefully you, as you listen to what I describe, will be able to see where each model overlaps, where each model is essentially different, but in principle, somewhere in the model, there is an in principle commonality. And the commonality is that each of the models would result in the experience that we have. So using the models may allow us to appreciate this experience in a different form to what we would appreciate it as if we didn't have a contemplation happening with the three different models that I'm going to put forward as a point of reference for our contemplation. So, with no further ado, let's get into it. There's a further reason as to why this is a very important exploration. Primarily, I would like to first aid in the recognition that life is always an experience arising in consciousness. And if we can appreciate that, which really means sense it in this moment, actually understand what that means, that this moment, the moment that is ever present, not in some mystical way, just, I mean, the life experience in each moment. What does it mean that it is an arising in consciousness? And if it's always an arising in consciousness, does this thing that the word consciousness is referring to, does it have to remain theoretical, or can it become something more visceral, something more known, something that, in fact, so known that we might say, oh, it is what I am. Not because we theoretically understand it's what I am, but because we experientially know ourselves as that. Now, there are a lot of nuances that often get left out because they can complicate the situation. So if I say we can know ourselves as consciousness, ultimately, I would prefer to say that we would know ourselves, or an aspect, that we would know that an aspect of ourself is consciousness. That consciousness is part of who I am, not necessarily all of who I am. But within the different models, the consciousness plays a different role or stems from a different place. So I know this can sound a bit confusing at the moment because I haven't put forward the models. But so the first aim in doing this is for us to maybe get a first-hand experiential sense that life is an experience arising in consciousness, and recognize the consciousness. So that's what's often referred to as an awakening experience, where awareness becomes aware of itself, where it becomes recognized that the whole experience is arising within awareness, is made of awareness, and is witnessed by awareness, that all there is awareness. Or we can substitute the word consciousness with awareness, because in my way of putting it forward, awareness is one of the two primary aspects of consciousness. The second aspect of consciousness is the sense of existence. So both awareness and the sense of existence are the two aspects of consciousness. And so when we're talking about either aspect of consciousness, we can sometimes interchange the word consciousness with the aspect of consciousness, like awareness, or the aspect of consciousness, which can be referred to as I amness or beingness. And once we appreciate that this present moment is all an arising in consciousness, or an arising in awareness, we can then understand why non-dual teachings say what they do, and what they're really trying to point at. We might even be able to appreciate that some of the things they say are not absolute truths, but they are concepts. They are part of a methodology that can aid shifts in happening. Now, often in teachings, things aren't explained in too much detail because that can be detrimental. In fact, some teachings, in a way, need to pull the wool over your eyes, not in a deceptive way, but in an effective way, in a way that brings about change. So what is really meant is not really explained. It can defeat the purpose. But at some point, I believe that seeking can heavily benefit from the introduction of critical thinking and are moving past certain teachings that say things in order to bring about change, but what they've said is not entirely true, but very useful. I've on occasion used the example of, if a father and child are running away from some danger, and they're coming up to a bridge, and if the father makes up some sort of fun game, diminishing the danger of the bridge and saying that, there's there's melted chocolate 2 feet under the bridge, but in order to receive something, we have to run across with our eyes closed or something like that, and then we'll be able to enjoy the melted chocolate. It's not entirely true. Well, it's not true at all in that case, but it serves a purpose to be able to get the child to run across with their eyes closed while the father is holding their hand, and for the child not to get scared and possibly hamper the objective of getting to the other side of the bridge. And so some statements in teachings are not entirely true, but in fact they're very useful, and the teaching would be less effective if it put forward a more detailed description. So in a way, teachings sometimes depend on us believing things in order to uproot more harmful beliefs that are already in place. So it's sort of like replacing one belief with another belief, but then that second belief can be uprooted more easily than the first one. So in order to uproot the first belief, another belief needs to take its place. So Ramana has pointed out, has recognized that this is what happens in teachings, and so he has used the analogy and said, use this thorn to uproot the thorn embedded in your thumb, and then be sure to throw both thorns away. So the thorn that he's saying to use as a tool is a spiritual concept. The thorn that is embedded in the thumb is a concept that has been turned into a belief. And so use this thorn to take out the belief, to uproot the belief. Then he says, be sure to throw both thorns away, not because you will be able to throw that tool away straight away, but because he knows it will get embedded in the place of the previous belief. And at some point, we'll have to realize, oh, this thorn that was meant to be a tool has become a new belief. And the recognition of that will be part of the falling away of even the spiritual teaching belief. So I'm taking a risk, in a way, and explaining teachings with the hope that at a certain point in time for a certain seeker, the explanation about why a teaching says something is in itself a teaching, a valid teaching. Whereas, as I said before, if that other teaching were to say why it's saying something, it would lose its power. So let's carry on. At the end of the day, I'd like to emphasize that it does all come back to peace of mind in daily living for the human being. So this exploration, if we didn't keep in mind that it's beneficial in the end for peace of mind for the human being in daily life, that it contributes, it can be part of the process that brings about the ending of suffering. And so really it's all about peace of mind in daily living. However, a lot of what I'll describe is more about states, is more about an exploration into the present moment. And it can therefore sound like it's about certain shifts, and it's about recognizing yourself as awareness or consciousness, for example. And if we don't keep in mind that that's only being embarked upon, that this exploration is only being embarked upon because certain shifts can be useful for the deliverance of peace of mind. So the shift in and of itself is not so important. In fact, a lot of these shifts tend to fade away at the right time. So it isn't about the experience that happens through the shift. It's about what has changed in the system as a result of the shift, and the shift can often lead to a different sense of who we are. And then at some point that the different sense of who we are can sort of fade away, and an integration into a more embodied experience of life, which is really just a new state. So if a shift happens and we then know ourselves as formless awareness, that shift can seem like it's got nothing to do with the human being, but it may well just be another state that is available, and it's a state of the human being, a state of the human being that doesn't feel like it has anything to do with the human being. And yet, I'm suggesting, from one perspective, we could see that it's just another state that is a human being state. A human being state where the sense is that what I am is consciousness. And that may be because what we really are is a human being, and consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the human being. And so it makes sense that we can find ourselves in the state where we are knowing that layer or that aspect of the human being. And other aspects of the human being, like thinking or like body sensations, can temporarily fall away. Doesn't mean that what we are is simply awareness. It means that in that state, that is what is being felt. As we go through this exploration in subsequent satsangs, we can then start to discuss some other topics that we may not be able to successfully discuss without doing this exploration. So let's look at these three theoretical models. The first one is the model that top-down Advaita teachings put forward. And that is that everything is God. That all there is God. That everything arises in God. And in the Advaita model, God is awareness or consciousness. And that the Advaita model says that life is an illusion arising within consciousness. It is a creation within the mind of God, or God is mind, and that God is imagining all of this into existence, and that God in motion is the whole universe arising within God, and outside of God there is nothing, absolute nothing. So God is the source, and everything is arising in God, which is consciousness or awareness. The nature of God is consciousness or awareness, and this is therefore all a play of consciousness. So that is one of the models that we'll be looking at. What it essentially means is that there is no cause or effect, ultimately, that God has created this experience within himself, has become the experience. And when God ceases to be this experience, the whole universe ceases to exist in that moment. The easiest way to get a sense for what I'm talking about is, or what that model is talking about, if someone doesn't already have a sense, is to use our night dream as as a comparison, to understand how all of this that is seems experientially seems to be very real and physical may actually all be an arising and a creation within God, not separate from God, that God consciousness has become the whole manifestation. So if we look at a night dream, we can understand that it arises as we generally know ourselves. We can understand that the night dream arises within the consciousness of the sleeper, the one in the bed. And that dream comes out of nowhere and arises in the consciousness or in the mind of the sleeper. And therefore the dream arises within that consciousness, is made of that consciousness and witnessed by that consciousness. And we know that a dream spontaneously arises and at some point it spontaneously collapses. And so if the dream is a dream of a beach and sun and people and wildlife, it from within the dream there is the created experience that is real and that time and space exists, and we can know that from when we position ourselves outside of the dream, we see that was a spontaneous creation that arose within consciousness. It was essentially an imagination, and at a certain point it collapsed, and all of the objects in the dream, the ocean, the sun, the people, collapsed with the dream. So it wasn't real in an absolute sense. It was a creation in consciousness. So now putting the idea of a sleeper, someone who's sleeping away, and we go back to the model of Advaita, and Advaita says God is consciousness, not consciousness in a person or in a brain, but just consciousness. That's all God is, consciousness. And there's consciousness at rest, which is absolute nothing. That's mind at rest. And something interesting, mind, if you spin the M upside down, it becomes wind. And wind is an interesting phenomenon. It's, if there's no movement, wind ceases. Wind is at rest. And wind requires there to be the movement for there to be wind. So when the movement stops, wind is in its potential form. And when the movement starts, wind becomes actual. And mind, as used in the Advaita sense, can be looked at like that. When mind is active in movement, when God is imagining, then mind explodes into action, and what is created within it was the whole universe. So this is somewhat mirrored in religion as well. That it says in Christianity, it's the universe was, or the world was created in 7 days, and on the seventh day such and such was created. Now, 7 days is still duration in time, but essentially they're sort of saying it wasn't created in thousands of years as it appeared, or millions, billions of years, but it was created in 7 days. So it's sort of popping the bubble of it being created according to evolution. And Advaita says it was created in an instant. So really it means God created it, not using the laws of cause and effect, but as a spontaneous imagination within God itself. And God is consciousness. So it's like the consciousness of the human, but without the need for there to be the human and the brain. God is just consciousness. All there is consciousness. And nothing exists outside of consciousness. Nothing exists outside of God. God is everything and nothing. So God at rest means absolute nothing. not even space outside of the nothing. So that is the absolute in Advaita. Absolute nothing, not even space, and not even awareness, aware of the nothing. God or source, not even aware of itself. And that doesn't mean dead nothing, because dead nothing would have no potential. So it is potential nothing. God in its potential form, consciousness in its potential form. And at any point in time, consciousness can explode into manifestation, explode into creation. And so the potential becomes the actualized. It can become the whole story of time and space, from the beginning of time to the end of time, all in an instant. That is one of the theoretical models that explains what this is. So this present moment is the creation of all of time being witnessed like a movie, like the film running through the film that already exists, all of time, running through the center frame. And all we see is the present moment. So your experience of life is always right now. Life has only ever been this present moment. So even when you were 5 years old at your birthday party as a 5-year-old, it was, at that time, it was now. So we've only ever experienced life now. And what is changing in the now is the content. And the content is said to be the creation in God's mind. All of it arising in consciousness, made of consciousness. Essentially like a dream in the mind of the human as the analogy, but this is a dream in the mind of God. So mind, consciousness, creates, manifests. That's why this is called the creation, often. So that's the model, that the theoretical model that is put forward to explain what life is from an awakened perspective. So from the unawakened perspective, life is experienced as an objective reality. Life is not thought or experienced to be an arising in consciousness. And so spiritual teachings are trying to bring about awakening, a recognition of what is, a movement beyond the illusion. So the teachings will say the illusion is to believe life to be as it presents. So the teachings will say life is not at all what it seems. Life is all a play in consciousness, but we don't recognize that. So the teachings are reminding us, life is an illusion. Life is not what it seems. And then they are trying to point us beyond the illusion to see the reality or to see the truth. They say that if we are lost in illusion, we don't know ourselves. And if we don't know ourselves, there is suffering. And so the quest within certain teaching frameworks is a quest for truth. And the truth is said to be the absolute or God. And so we're on a quest to know ourselves as God, to know ourselves as consciousness, to know ourselves as the absolute. All of that within that particular framework. Now the question is that true? Is that the truth, that all of this is an arising within consciousness, and God is consciousness, and there is nothing outside of God. There is nothing outside of consciousness. That the world that arises right now is an experience in consciousness that seems to be very objectively real, but that is ultimately an experience designed to create the impression, that everything is objectively real. An experience designed to create the impression of time and space. And we know that this can happen. We can have an experience that is not ultimately real, but from within the experience feels very real. We know this because we have the benefit of being able to look at our dreams at night from the outside and see that it's very possible for an imagination within consciousness to arise, and for that imagination, which is essentially an experience, to create very specific sensations and impressions about what the experience really is. And it's only when we wake up out of the dream that we realize, oh, well, that tiger that was chasing me was not real. And in fact, the character that was being chased was not real. And the jungle in which it was being chased was not real in a fundamental or in an absolute sense. It was real as an experience. But it wasn't a representation of truth, i.e. that the tiger was not a representation of a real tiger, although from within the experience it felt and seemed to be very real. And in fact, the dream character felt itself to be very real. And from within the dream, it seemed like there was no possibility of knowing that it wasn't really that real. It seemed like there was no possibility of knowing that the dream was an arising within consciousness. And yet from outside of the dream, we get to see that, wow, this creation within consciousness can be experienced exactly as it is designed by the thought, by the imagination to be experienced. So going back to this model of Advaita, Advaita says this whole experience of life, of objective reality, things that feel very solid and real, all of the senses, the impression of time and space is all part of the creation, part of the imagination within God. And awakening is a recognition, an awakening to the fact that this is not as real as it seems, that it actually is an arising in consciousness. And that awakening is not really an awakening out of the dream. It's an awakening to the fact it is a dream, or it is a creation within consciousness. And that awakening is not just a belief. It is a shift in the experience itself. The experience changes such that the experience is seen from a different perspective, from a different angle, seen from an angle that essentially informs us that what we are is not what we previously experienced ourselves to be. In the awakening experience, the sense is that what I am is awareness, not the body, whereas before awakening there was the sense that I was the body. Now, in that moment of awakening, it seems like the truth has been revealed. It seems like the illusion of being the body has been removed. But what is it that makes us say that the previous experience that felt like truth was not real, and that this experience is real? What makes us say it is, in part, that the old one fell away, and then this presented. And from the point of view of where there is the experience where the sense of being consciousness is present, when that's present, we go, oh, this is what's real. And we have a sense or a remembrance of the old, and we say, oh, that was the illusion. We might actually be mistaking the new experience for truth or reality, and not recognizing that it too may well just be experience arising in consciousness. So that is one of the theoretical models, that all of this is arising within the mind of God. Another of the models that would still explain life is the model whereby we say there actually is an objective planet in an objective universe. Objective meaning real and solid as it appears, a universe or a planet that has some existence within a framework of time and space. So essentially, the universe as we more or less know it, we say that actually is real. And on planet Earth, there are trees that grow within the framework of time and space. And at some point in the evolution of the Earth, animals, organisms, and then biological organisms that developed into animals, and eventually human beings came into existence. And these human beings are objective and real. They live within or on the objectively real planet. And the brain has developed, first in animals and then in humans, and it developed to such a complexity that consciousness became part of the output of that instrument. Now, as part of teachings, in order to break us away from the assessment of life in a way that keeps it more or less fixed, we hear no, consciousness can not be a result of the brain. And one of the supports for that is that science doesn't understand consciousness, and the medical profession can't tell us where consciousness came from. Now that doesn't mean we don't. The physical universe, as we know it, has a quantum aspect to it, and so the brain is, at least in part, a quantum instrument. And anyone in the history of physics and quantum science that came sort of advanced beyond the average understanding has said, be sure that if anyone tells you that they understand quantum physics, they absolutely don't. So those people in history and in the present that have sort of understood quantum physics more than anyone else says that they have no idea what quantum physics is. And so if someone tries to tell you they understand quantum physics, they have absolutely no idea and think they do. So if the brain is a quantum instrument, who are we to know that the brain can't actually produce consciousness as an output of a quantum instrument? Now, I'm not saying that that's what it is, and I'm not saying that the first model that Advaita puts forward is what it is or is not what it is. See, this is the beauty that we have to break out of as seekers, is breaking out of this idea that we know certain things that we don't know. We can know some things relatively, and that's good enough for certain outcomes, and it's good enough for to deliver certain things. We can't really know anything absolutely, and often in life and in seeking, we mistake relative knowledge and think it's that we know it absolutely. Now, if we make that mistake of thinking we know something absolutely, tends to keep us away from seeing things more clearly. It's a fundamental mistake that keeps us away from knowing ourselves fully. So, falling into the trap of saying that the Advaita model is truth is a seeking mistake. Why that happens is because the Advaita model is put forward that everything is God, everything arises in God, and life is not as it seems, cause and effect is not real, time and space are not real. what you are is awareness. Pleasure and pain don't exist. They are just mental interpretation, and mental interpretations are relative, and what you are is the absolute. And so the mental interpretations need to be discarded or diminished into the realm of illusion. That's the teaching methodology. It's a beautiful teaching methodology. So don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing any methodologies. Many of you have heard me say that I think all teachings dovetail in with each other, and even what we might call the most basic teaching is the right teaching for some people. A complex teaching is often completely inappropriate for certain groups of people. And then a basic teaching is no good for another group of people. So teachings are not one's right and the other's wrong. They're all doing a job. And at the end of the day, all teachings need to fall away because they're all relative. So in this framework, it's often said, made very clear, whatever is put forward is a concept, not the truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. Now, that last part is there for very good reason, but it's not so important when I'm just trying to point out that the teaching is making the point that whatever is said, whatever is written down is a concept, not the truth. That whatever anyone in history has said, no matter how liberated or enlightened, what they have put forward is a concept, not the truth. The concepts are pointers, and so that is there to eventually allow a seeker to relate to the teachings in a healthy way. As we mentioned, often a teaching requires us to relate to it in an unhealthy way, where we hold on to it as a belief. And ironically, holding on to it in an unhealthy way can be very useful, but at some point it needs to be, the understanding needs to be refined, and the refining of the understanding means we will let go of certain teaching concepts. And so within teachings, within these wisdom frameworks, there are always those little hints that get us to understand that this is what is in the teaching. So we've heard in certain Buddhist teachings, it's analogies saying use the boat to get you across the lake or the river, but then don't carry the boat around with you. It means it's done its job, now put it down and move on. There's also saying that if you see Buddha on the road, kill him, which really means don't hold on to Buddha, don't idolize what Buddha is saying. Essentially, Buddha, the teachings, the Dharma, at some point need to be treated as if they are the enemy. Once they've done their job, if you hold on to them as if they're a precious friend, you will be essentially still holding on to a belief, which will prevent us from just seeing what is. We've all heard the teachings that say, don't mistake the roadmap for the territory itself. Don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. So teachings are a description. And the description is exactly that, a description of what is. And when in this teaching we say whatever is said is a concept and not the truth, it's because the truth is so multifaceted, and a concept can only describe it from a very particular point of view. So a concept can never be the truth itself. If I describe the taste of a strawberry, it's going to be so limited compared to the thing itself. If I'm looking at a water tank that is cylindrical and I look at it front on and I describe it, or I draw a side view of it, it would be a rectangle. And if I look at the same cylindrical water tank from on top and I describe it, it would be, or I draw a top view of it, it's a circle. So from two different perspectives, the description is different. And if we don't understand that it's a description of the truth, the thing itself, a description from a particular angle, we'll start arguing that, well, which one is right? Because this says it's a rectangle and this one says it's a circle. They're both correct because they're describing the thing from different angles. So a concept really is going to have to take a particular point of view and say, oh, what you are is consciousness. And from a particular point of view, it's correct. There's an aspect of yourself that is consciousness. But that doesn't mean that that concept is absolutely correct, because what if there is another adjoining aspect of who we are that is not consciousness but is something different? And so if we stick with the concept that says what I am is just consciousness, that's all, then we might be holding onto the concept too rigidly. We might be saying what I am is a rectangle without realizing that when I put two concepts together, they can create a better pointing to what the truth is. So, going back to the second version 2 of what this might be, or what life as we know it is possibly stemming from. Version 2 was the earth is an objective earth and trees are objectively real, time and space has some sort of objective reality, and there is a human being that has come into existence as part of evolution, and brains at a certain time came into existence in animals, and we're saying that brains may well be an instrument that produces consciousness. And therefore, the human being and the animals are biological instruments through which consciousness is functioning. And because consciousness is functioning through the human being is able to be consciously aware thanks to the consciousness and the senses of the external world. A world which actually does exist outside of the human, a tree that has an objective reality, another animal or another person that has an objective reality. And it's only because of the consciousness functioning through the human being that that objective reality is able to be known. But what is known, when we look at it, is not actually the objective reality, but a subjective impression of what is outside of the human being. That is what everyone has, if Model 2 is where this experience comes from. That means that there is an objective world, but we only ever know our model or our impression of it, our image of it. And the image of it means that there is the body with its senses, and let's take the eye as one of the instruments, and light from the external world bounces off the objectively real object. The light is received by the eyes process all of that information, send it to the brain. The image through the lens of the eyes is inverted. So the eyes send an inverted image to the brain. That energy or those signals are converted by the brain. The image is flipped around the right way, and then what we experience is an image that is actually arising inside of our consciousness. But what we experience is the image as if it isn't an image. The third model that could explain all of this is that there is a far more advanced civilization than the civilization on Earth. And either for entertainment purposes or for rehabilitation purposes, humans or entities that exist in this advanced civilization, let's say in the year 2400, are being subjected or subjecting themselves to a virtual world experience. It could be that there are a bunch of misfits whereby evolution hasn't quite worked out the same as it has for the rest of society. And these misfits in the year 2400 experience suffering. They can't see life as it is. They don't know themselves. And so that society has developed a rehabilitation program out of love to try and bring about the change that is required in order for the, let's say, a human or whatever living entity it is, to know itself more truly. And maybe this experience that we know as daily life is the experience from within the virtual world that is the year 2400 equivalent of rehabilitation. It could be the year 2400's version of going to the movies, just entertainment. And so what that might look like is someone walking in off the street into an entertainment establishment, lying down on a bed, being sedated, having something hooked up to their brain, and their consciousness being inserted into a digitally created world. And the result of that may well be the equivalent of someone having a dream at night. The equivalent, we have versions of this in our crude version of virtual reality. So in a more advanced form of virtual reality, the experience would arise as soon as the person is sedated, and then they would know themselves as the character within the virtual world. And it makes sense that from within the experience, if it is designed to be like the experience we all know as life, then that's what would be experienced. So these are three different theoretical models of what life is. Each of those models is different in principle. One is everything is arising in a mind of God and there is no external world. The other is there is an external world that isn't arising in the mind of God. It was put together by impersonal forces of physics that didn't come from a God. And as part of that objective world, human beings came into existence, and the brain is able to produce consciousness and thoughts, and therefore the subjective experience of the external world is what we are all having. And the third is that we are essentially in a virtual world of a person in the year 2400 having a virtual experience. So in model one, God essentially is consciousness, omniscient, all-knowing, the creator of everything in model one. In model two, God is essentially the human being. The human being is the God of its creation. But the human being doesn't have control over what it creates. It is a creation that is a result of the way that the physical, the objective world is received by the organism, by the biological organism, and the experience arises exactly as it is destined to arise based on the physical factors in the world. But essentially, there isn't a God that fits into the same description as if model 1 is what's happening. And in model 3, the God of this creation, depending on how it is, could be the the computer programmers that have designed the world, or the medical staff that have designed the world in conjunction with the computer programmers. Now, we don't need to know which of the three models it is. What is most important is to recognize that whichever of the three models it is, what would result is the experience that we are having right now in daily life, which is an experience that is arising in consciousness, and that without consciousness, there would be no capacity to be aware of the experience, which means the experience is interdependent with consciousness. That consciousness, if consciousness was removed, the whole experience would collapse. So that tells us that essentially what we know as our experience of an external world, according to all three models, is really an experience arising in consciousness, an experience dependent on consciousness, not separate from consciousness, and witnessed by consciousness. In all three models, all we get to know is the experience, which is the present moment, right here, right now. So, if using the three theoretical models, we can start to get a feel for how the experience of daily life that we have is not what it seems. We might get a feel that, or we might realize that I walk through the world with no appreciation of consciousness. It's always been there. It's so consistently the background of the experience that it goes unnoticed. And instead what gets noticed is the gross aspects of the experience, the sense, the smell, the taste, the sight, the touch. And all of that creates the impression, or is an experience of a objectively real world that is outside of who I am. And so the teachings of Advaita are so impressive, because what they say to a seeker is life is not what it seems. And then they put forward what is really a model, but it isn't put forward as if it's a model, it's put forward as if this is the truth. That everything is an arising inside of God, and God is awareness, and there is nothing outside of God. Now, those concepts can be very powerful, because at some point if we become a seeker, we say, I just want to know the truth. And the teaching can say, look, you don't know the truth. You are caught in the illusion, and this is the truth. And because we want to know the truth, as we listen and engage in the teaching is slowly bringing about change. And at a certain point in time, there can be a shift whereby life is experienced from a completely different perspective. What falls away is the sense that I am a body in the world. And what takes its place is that the world is arising inside the consciousness that I am. A complete shift in the nature of reality. The experience completely changes. And the sense of who we are changes. The sense of what the world is changes from being a world experienced as a whole lot of objective objects, real objects, to a recognition that this is an ephemeral experience in consciousness, no different to a dream. And when that shift happens, our intellect makes the mistake of interpreting the experience as being a reflection of truth, because the teachings said that life is an illusion, that we don't see things as they are. And that continual pointing of the teaching, continually reinforcing, you are not the body. What you are is consciousness. What you are is that which is aware of the body. That continual reinforcing does something that brings about this change, and then we start to relate to life as seen from this new perspective, and we solidify the model that was put forward, because the model was so effective. The model brought about change in a way that, that sort of confirmed that the model is the truth. That shift and that awakening is an awakening that can happen in any of the models. It is because that shift of recognizing life as an arising in consciousness, because that happens, it doesn't mean that it's model one that is the truth. Because if we just stuck with model two, which is the existence of a objectively real human that functions a particular way, that has consciousness, and thanks to consciousness and the senses, receives an image of the external world, and that image is reconstructed within the consciousness of the human being, much like a night dream, then with the right pointings within using that model, the same awakening could happen, the same shift could happen, whereby there can be a realization that, what this is an arising in consciousness, and that the body that I always knew myself as is in itself part of everything arising in consciousness. So exactly the same awakening could happen if a different framework, a different explanation of reality is put forward. And similarly, the model 3, that this is all a virtual world, can be understood and could in fact create an awakening and a collapsing of a lot of the beliefs in the system, beliefs that time and space are real, that what I am in essence is the body. All of those beliefs could be completely challenged by a description that actually this could well be the virtual world created by someone who is sedated, and technologies projecting an image into their consciousness. So I'm hoping that maybe some people listening that have come through the top-down Advaita models and have had awakenings and have realized the nature of life is experience arising in consciousness may question, say, can I know that that confirms, because there's a fairly good chance that there has been a belief set in place that is a belief that I am not the body, I am consciousness, and that consciousness is the consciousness of God, because that's essentially the Advaita model. We can say, do I know this for sure? Or is it that all I know is the experience that is definitely, I have no doubt that the experience is an arising within consciousness, and the construct of the experience can shift such that it is perceived from a different angle. So essentially it means the experience is created differently in a specific moment, and that can remain consistent for quite some time, where the experience is witnessed from a different perspective, witnessed not from the point of being the body, but from being consciousness. But does that prove that model one is reality? With enough contemplation, we'll realize it doesn't. Other models can explain all of these shifts. But what is important is to become awakened to the consciousness that's actually here now. If there is that shift, and this shift doesn't have to take place, but some of the important changes that take place in this awakening to consciousness can happen in much more subtle ways. But in the case of the awakening to life being an arising in consciousness, what happens is a witnessing of things that previously couldn't be witnessed starts to happening. So a witnessing of thoughts can happen, a witnessing of feelings can happen, a witnessing of the body moving with a sense that that is not me doing it. It's just happening. Thoughts are happening, movements are happening, emotions are happening. Whereas before that shift took place, the sense is that I am absolutely the doer of everything that happens, and there's no experiential perspective that can understand any description of non-doership or of life being a spontaneous happening. There's no sense from an experiential point of view of what all that means. And what is more important, because remember I did say at the beginning that really this is all about peace of mind and daily living. So this shift in and of itself to know oneself as consciousness is not really that important. What's important is that something has broken, some identification has broken. What used to be a merging of layers because of the way that the experience was being created, that merging of layers has stopped, and a separation of the layers has happened. Not in a way where separation that causes problem, but separation that allows a more objective perspective on things. To be able to feel thoughts without being lost in them. To be able to feel emotions without being lost in them. And when that happens in our seeking, a lot of what is described in the spiritual teaching starts to make so much more sense. It's essentially a weakening, a very significant weakening of the psychological structure, because an aspect of the human being, the awareness or the consciousness, is now seeing certain movements as impersonal, whereas previously the experience was that the thinking is my thinking, and if there is a negative thought, the sense is I am negative. We didn't even see that it was a negative thought. It was a sense of I am negative. I am suffering. And so this shift, this witnessing, allows things that are actually not personal to be experienced as not personal. And so from that point on, the movement towards peace of mind can happen very much more efficiently. So when we then start hearing explanations of non-doership and non-attachment, something in the system has shifted. there is an ability to rest in the aspect of the human being that is in itself complete, in itself not lost and intertwined and merged with the intellect, especially the thinking mind intellect, that is seeking fulfillment in the future. So all of these shifts can be important. They aren't in and of themselves what we're really looking for. We're not really looking to know ourselves as consciousness in which the whole world arises. That is what we might be told that we're looking for in order to bring about that shift, in order to bring about a realization. And once we start to contemplate that life is not as it is, that the experience of life is maybe not what it appears to be, we start to look at life on a consistent basis. Just even if we haven't had the clear seeing that everything is an arising in consciousness, we might just have the models, and the models might allow us, as we're walking through the park, to sort of question, say, wow, that tree that appears to be outside of me. If we've understood the model, we say, really, that tree is not outside of me, but it is arising within what I am as consciousness. Now, that might be the consciousness of a human being. It may be the consciousness of God, because that's all there is God, and there is no actual physical world. There is only the experience of a world. But it may be that there is a physical world with a human being in it. And yet, if that is the model, still, when we're walking through the park, we'll be able to be amazed at the truth of the matter. And the truth of the matter is that it feels like I am walking in a park. And on one level, we are, because if there's an objective world, there is a human being walking in a park, but we might start to get a sense. But what I have is an experience of the external world that is not really the external world, but an image arising inside the consciousness of the human being. So what I know as life is only ever an experience. Now, this is so crucial for us to start knowing the relativity, the changeability, the fact that life is an experience, and at some point, experience is going to come to an end. When we have awoken to the fact that life is an experience arising in consciousness and can experience it from that perspective, not knowing whether it's model one that is the reason why the life experience is happening, or still not knowing whether it's model 2 or model 3. But realizing that life is an experience arising in consciousness, and we can go through the world amazed at the fact that life is always a subjective experience, designed and created to be exactly the way it is. So we know that if I feel hot, that's part of the experience. If I feel lost, that's part of the experience. If there is peace of mind, that's part of the experience. If there's suffering, that's part of the experience. And in deep sleep, the experience collapses, and there's the absence of experience, and there's no problems. And then the experience comes back again in what we know as waking up in the morning, and we go, oh, here's experience again. And I get to experience myself however I experience myself within the experience. The experience will be pleasurable or painful, peaceful in the face of pleasure or pain, or there will be involvement in the pleasure or pain. And the more this is known, the less that death becomes an issue. Because life will be known as an experience. It's always been an experience from the beginning to the end. And each night the experience collapses. And with the collapse of the experience, there is the collapse of the sense of being human. There is essentially the collapse of the experience of being human. Now, that doesn't mean that the human ceases to exist. In Model 2, the human would be sleeping in their bed, but without the experience of a world, because the consciousness of the human being at night goes into rest mode, and therefore the experience of the world is not perceived. The world in Model 2 is still out there, but it's not perceived, which means, in effect, the whole universe has collapsed. In effect, meaning our experience of the universe has collapsed. So, which of the three models it is, and there are many other models that would explain this experience of life that we have, is not so important. What is important is to start to be able to know the experience of life as an experience, to be able to sit quietly in meditation and realize that in meditation the experience, as soon as the eyes have closed, the experience changes radically. The experience of a world of form changes radically. All of the sight objects are no longer there. Now that doesn't mean that the actual objects in the objective world, if Model 2 is what's happening, doesn't mean they're not there, but it means our awareness of them isn't there. And with this appreciation that life is an experience, the experience is witnessed much more. Both the external, what seem like external objects, and also the internal objects, the feelings, the behaviors, the reactions, the words, the movement of the body. And that creates a distancing. It means that life is taken much less personally. And then the notion of non-doership and non-attachment become something experienced and felt. It becomes very obvious from this perspective of seeing everything as a experience arising in consciousness, from whichever model you choose, that I, as the character, am not the doer of the experience. I am part of the experience. That the thoughts are a result of either God's will as God creating a spontaneous experience moment after moment, and the thoughts arise and are experienced as part of the spontaneous creation, along with the speaking and the moving of the body. And therefore, the conviction, I'm not the doer, that everything is unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, can be there. And then going to Model 2, we realize that if there is a human being in an objective world, then that human being in the objective world is essentially designed by life, genes and up-to-date conditioning. It's a biological instrument through which consciousness is functioning, and it will receive the external world the only way that it can, and thoughts will arise the only way that they can, given the circumstance. Emotions will arise the only way they can. Suffering is just a happening like everything else. And so this seeing of life as an experience is useful because it creates this capacity to witness. The capacity to witness allows us to see that what is happening is not my doing. It is a happening according to God's will. It is a happening according to the life experience. Everything that happens from this perspective I'm talking about, regardless of which model it is. I have to keep saying it. It's not about which model it is. It's about the experience itself. Where it comes from is irrelevant. What is important is that there is the experience of being a human being. That experience is consistently there. It will consistently be there. But hopefully we start to see that what the human being does, how it speaks, how it acts, how it feels, is all part and parcel of the experience and not in the control of the character, not in control of the human being. And that then allows the human being to continue to allow the body to function as it functions. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. The human being is not going to become a perfect human being, but the aspect of the human being, the consciousness that is aware of life, and the intellect, the working mind, can then understand that the movement is going to happen, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, but there is no one doing it. In another satsang, depending on whether there's an interest, because as I said at the beginning of this talk, this was an ambitious project to embark on. We can, from this base, start looking at why it is said that there is no person in certain Advaita teachings, and hopefully transition to a point where we understand, even given this is an experience, and ultimately anything in the experience is not fundamentally real, even if this is a dream or a virtual world, or a arising in the consciousness, the mind of God, the human being is forced to continue to live in the dream as the dream character. The dream, even if it's seen to be an arising in consciousness, still includes time and space. The dream, the experience, always unfolds according to cause and effect. Even if we understand that cause and effect is not ultimately real in some of the models, it might not be ultimately real, but nonetheless it's there, consistently there. And pleasure and pain, even if we can see that they are part of the layering of the experience, they're not just a mental interpretation. The pleasure or pain is a result of the biological instrument. And even if, like in a dream, there isn't really a biological instrument, the dream is consistently created to unfold as if we are the human being. Maybe we are. In Model 2, we would say we are the human being on the external world, and we only have the experience of the external world arising within the consciousness of that human being. Whichever model you take, at some point we need to realize I have to live for as long as this experience of life is here, as the human being functioning in a world of time and space, in a world interacting with others, experiencing pleasure and pain sometimes. And the best I can hope for is to have an experience of life that is free of suffering, an experience of life where there is a comfortableness with oneself. And that comes back to the beliefs in doership and attachment to outcome. And it doesn't matter how great the awakening is, if that awakening doesn't help us see that the human being within the experience is not in control of what happens in the future, was not in control of what happened in the past, and is not in control of what happens in the present. If that understanding doesn't become total, then what you're going to have is a witnessing of life as an experience with suffering still arising. And sure, if the witnessing is there, then the suffering is less intense in a way. It's not as personal. But that's not the end of suffering, is it? The end of suffering is when the suffering no longer arises. It means when there is no misunderstanding left in the system. For as long as suffering is arising, even if it's not arising for someone, from a certain perspective of life, we say there is just suffering arising, but that's because there's still misunderstanding in the system. When the misunderstanding in the system falls away, then even that suffering arises, and then life is lived. Hopefully we come back to living as the human being. We don't remain out there thinking that life needs to be lived as consciousness or from the perspective of consciousness. Come back to accepting that for as long as this experience is here, it is an experience of time and space. It is an experience of many human beings with interhuman relationships. And realize that that's not the problem. Being human is not the problem. Living a human life is not the problem. It's perfectly fine to be a human and say, yes, I am this entity that arises within the experience of life. I experience myself as this entity. I experience life from the perspective of this human being. And life is a problem when I experience myself as a human being that suffers. When I experience myself as a human being that doesn't suffer, life is fine. Life is acceptable. And even death is acceptable, because we would have lived a whole lifetime of experience, knowing that life is experience, a bit like a movie or a book, and we know that the experience has to come to an end sometime. We've experienced the temporary end of the experience every night in deep sleep, and there's no problem. In fact, all problems fall away. And so at some point when the suffering has fallen away, which means we come to know ourselves fully as a human being, know that there is a biological aspect to the human being, that there is consciousness and awareness and a sense of being functioning through the human being, and we can rest there. We can sit in a room quietly with ourselves, knowing that nothing is missing, that what I am at my core is complete, and rest in that completeness. And yet still get on with functional daily living at other times, and be ready to accept psychologically that death at some point will just mean the end of experience. This doesn't mean that we won't be fearful of physical death. If a tiger were in the room, I would be very scared physically, biologically, very scared of the tiger. That's not the fear of death that makes life so uncomfortable. The fear of death that makes life so uncomfortable is where we have a psychological fear of not existing. A psychological fear of, but what are all the things I would have missed out on? And I won't be able to spend time with my loved ones. And there are some people that simply can't fathom not being here because they haven't yet achieved what life is about. That's their sense. Is I can't die now because I haven't achieved what life's about. They don't necessarily know what that is, but they're convinced that it hasn't been achieved because of a feeling of uncomfortableness. And therefore dying is just not appropriate. The notion that there'll be nothing after death scares us to death. That is the fear of death. The psychological imagination that tells us that death is terrible, whereas in fact, death is beautiful. Death is the end of experience, and we would have, if we realized that life is all experience, had more than enough experience. And death is essentially the final chapter, the end. In some of the Indian scriptures, enlightenment is referred to as samadhi, so peace. And death is referred to as mahasamadhi, the great peace. Death is being relieved of even the burden of the flow of life, being relieved of the burden of having to climb stairs, of having to nurse an aging body, of having to undergo what can start to become quite strenuous physical parts of life. So liberation is the liberation from suffering. Death, Mahasamadhi, is the ultimate liberation. Liberation from even the flow of life. Liberation from the pleasures and pains. And at some point would say, I have experienced enough pleasure to know what pleasure is. Maybe I haven't experienced all pleasures, but definitely enough pleasure to know what pleasure is. And if I got to experience some new pleasures, they would be different, but still fit within the category of pleasure. And I've experienced pain. I know what pain is, and I will be grateful when the life experience means no more pain. At a certain age, I'm sure we would say, enough. I've had enough. Not from suffering, but just from a very practical, the time has come. I'm ready for the ultimate peace.